The wind along Alaska's western coast has a way of cutting through silence, carrying with it a mix of salt ice and stories older than memory. On one late afternoon near Nome, Daniel, a retired fisherman with hands still shaped by decades of hauling nets, walked the shoreline with his camera. He had promised himself he would spend retirement capturing images of wild animals instead of hauling them from the sea. Beside him, Mia, a wildlife photographer visiting from Anchorage, moved with practiced quiet scanning for polar bear tracks. They were hoping to catch a glimpse of a mother and her cubs returning from a hunt. What they found instead would test their beliefs about nature and compassion. At first, it was only a sound faint muffled, almost like the call of a gull in distress. Daniel thought it might be the creaking of ice or the cry of a seal, but then Mia froze. Through her lens, she spotted movement in the snow-dusted brush just beyond the beach. She lowered the camera, eyes wide. A polar bear cub, barely larger than a husky, was thrashing weakly, its white fur streaked with dirt. Wrapped tightly around its torso and neck was a massive python, scales glistening like wet rope in the dim light. Daniel blinked hard, as if his mind was trying to reject what his eyes confirmed. Pythons weren't supposed to be here. Invasive snakes were a Florida problem, not an Alaskan one, but this was no hallucination. The predator's coils tightened, pressing the air from the cub's chest. Each shallow gasp was slower than the last. The cub's paw twitched, claws scraping helplessly at the ground. And in that moment, the landscape around them, the sky, the ocean, the distant hum of the village fell silent. Only two choices remained: watch nature unfold or intervene. Mia's first instinct was to raise her camera. Years of documenting endangered animals had taught her to record, not disturb. Yet as she zoomed in on the cub's trembling eyes, something shifted. Those eyes didn't look like a subject for wildlife photography. They looked like a plea. Daniel, meanwhile, clenched his fists. He had lived his whole life by a code: respect the order of the wild. Fish eat, fish bears hunt seals, storms claim boats. You accept it. But here he saw something that didn't fit. A polar bear cub, the very symbol of the Arctic, locked in battle with a python that had no place in this frozen ecosystem. This wasn't balanced. It was an intrusion. Maybe it's already too late, Daniel muttered, voice rough with doubt. Maybe we let it go. He remembered the words of an old forester he once knew. Interfere, and you carry the consequences. But then Mia stepped closer, dropping her camera into the snow. Look again, she whispered. And he did. The cub's chest, though crushed by coils, still lifted faintly. Life clung on. However slim, there was still a chance. Survival in the wild is rarely fair. We imagine wild animals thriving in perfect cycles, predators hunting prey, running forests, renewing. But invasive species, climate shifts, and human mistakes disrupt these cycles. A python in Alaska was proof of how fragile systems are. The python's hunger was real, but its presence here was unnatural. If balance had already been broken, perhaps compassion was not a violation, but a restoration. They approached cautiously. The python sensed movement and tightened its grip. The cub wheezed, mouth opening soundlessly. Daniel grabbed a broken piece of driftwood, his hands trembling, and nudged at the coils. The snake struck in response, teeth grazing the wood, missing his arm by inches. Mia, heart racing, circled to the other side, pulling gently at the tail. For several tense minutes, the struggle seemed hopeless. The snake's muscles were stronger than their combined force. But then, in a moment of desperate improvisation, Daniel wedged the driftwood beneath the coils and levered downward with all the strength his shoulders could summon. The python hissed, loosened slightly, and Mia pulled harder. The cub coughed a fragile sound that filled them with fuel. Finally, after what felt like hours compressed into minutes, the coils slackened enough for the cub to roll free. It lay motionless at first, sides heaving, eyes barely open. Daniel crouched beside it, hand hovering but not touching. "It's alive," Mia whispered, her voice breaking. They both stared at the cub, struck not only by relief but by the enormity of what they had done. In those tense moments, they had crossed a line from witnesses of nature to participants in it. The python retreated silently into the brush, leaving behind only the imprint of its coils in the snow. The cub, bruised, but breathing had been given another chance. This wasn't the first time people had been forced to decide whether to step in. Years earlier in Montana, ranchers had found a black bear cub tangled in barbed wire. Some argued to leave it, insisting survival belonged only to the strong. Others cut the wire, freeing the animal. The bear limped away, and the debate lingered long after. Was compassion interference, or was it part of being human? Standing over the rescued polar bear cub, Daniel and Mia felt the same weight pressing down on them. They didn't know if the cub would survive the night, but they knew doing nothing would have haunted them more than failing. For the audience watching the scene may sound almost unbelievable, a python entwined with a polar bear cub in the Alaskan wild. Yet stranger encounters happen every year as climates shift and animals wander into territories they were never meant to reach. Exotic pets are released, invasive species spread, and native wildlife pays the price. A python, where it does not belong, is not just an oddity, it is a symbol of how human choices ripple through ecosystems in ways we rarely predict. Empathy doesn't wait for permission. It shows up in the hesitation of a fisherman's hand, in the trembling voice of a photographer, in the decision to fight for one fragile life. Sometimes helping an animal in distress is less about saving the wild and more about remembering what makes us human. The cub's survival wasn't guaranteed, but the choice to act said something about the rescuer's values, a reminder that compassion can coexist with respect for nature. As Daniel and Mia stood snow crunching beneath their boots, they knew this was only the beginning. The cub's bruises would need time to heal. The village would have its opinions. Experts would debate whether the intervention was right or wrong. But one thing was certain: they had witnessed an extraordinary clash, and their decision had set in motion a story bigger than either of them. For now, they could only watch the cub rise unsteadily to its feet, take a staggering step, and collapse again in the snow. It was alive, and that was enough. The tide whispered against the shore as twilight deepened. Daniel brushed snow from his jacket heart, still hammering. Mia raised her camera again, but this time not to document a tragedy, it was to record resilience. She captured the cub's trembling breath, the faint shimmer of its eyes in the fading light. Then she lowered the lens and looked at Daniel. "We'll need help," she said quietly. He nodded. The rescue wasn't finished. It had only begun. And somewhere in the shadows, the python slipped silently into the wilderness, its hunger unresolved. Would the cub recover? Or would this night simply be a pause before loss? That question lingered in their minds as they carried the story back to the village. The answer, uncertain and fragile, would unfold in the days to come. In the next part, we'll step deeper into the predator's world. To understand what happened on that shoreline and why it matters, we need to know the python's story, its instincts, its mechanics, and the strange path that brought it into conflict with an Arctic cub. The python slipped back into the brush, leaving behind its imprint in the snow, but for Daniel and Mia, its presence lingered like a shadow. They had freed the polar bear cub, yet their thoughts kept circling. The same question: how had a snake built for swamps and heat found its way to the Alaskan coast? It was a mystery worth unraveling, because without understanding the predator, no one could understand the rescue. Later that evening, the village gathered in the small community hall. Fishermen, elders, children, all drawn by the story that traveled faster than the tide. At the front sat Dr. Gregory, a visiting biologist who had been studying invasive species in the US. He had just returned from Florida, where Burmese pythons had been overwhelming the Everglades. As Daniel finished recounting the encounter, Gregory leaned forward, hands clasped. "You must realize," he began, "this wasn't just a random snake. It's a symbol of what happens when wild animals are displaced." He explained in plain words. Pythons are ambush predators. They strike with sudden speed, locking their coils around prey, tightening with each breath until the victim can no longer inhale. Unlike venomous snakes, they kill with pressure, not poison. Once the prey is subdued, they swallow it whole bones, and all their jaws stretching wide. In tropical regions, this is survival. But here, with a polar bear cub, it became something else entirely. A reminder that human actions can carry predators across continents, forcing unnatural clashes. Mia remembered the moment the snake struck the driftwood, its jaws clamping down with terrifying force. She shuddered, but she also felt curiosity. Why here? Why now? She asked. Gregory gave an unsettling answer. Exotic pet trade. Over the past decades, rare animals have been sold as pets. Some escaped, others were released by owners who couldn't manage them. In Florida, thousands of Burmese pythons breed unchecked, consuming everything from rabbits to endangered birds. It was not impossible, he said, for one, to have been transported accidentally or deliberately northward. It only takes one predator introduced to the wrong place to upset the balance. For the villagers, the explanation opened a debate. Was the python just following instinct, or was it a trespasser with no rightful claim? An elder named Samuel spoke up, voice steady from years of watching tides come and go. I've seen polar bears hunt seals. Brutal, yes, but natural. This was different. This was someone's mistake, and the cub nearly paid the price. His words carried weight. The rescue wasn't simply interference, it was correction. It was humanity cleaning up the mess humanity had created. And here lies the subtle lesson. Not all struggles in the wild are equal. Some are ancient dances of survival. Others are collisions born from human disruption. The python wasn't evil. It was hungry. But it also wasn't meant to coil itself around a cub that symbolizes one of the most endangered animals on Earth. To step in was not about breaking rules. It was about recognizing which rules had already been broken, to make this real for the audience. Gregory shared an example from the Everglades. He spoke of a wildlife rescue team that once cut open a python's stomach and found the remains of a deer fawn inside. The deer had been part of a delicate food chain that fed panthers and wolves. With every python meal, native predators starved. When we talk about invasive predators, he said softly, we're not just talking about one kill. We're talking about ripple effects that change whole ecosystems. The villagers listened in silence, picturing what would have happened had Daniel and Mia walked away. The cub's death would have been more than a tragedy. It would have been a message that the balance had already been shattered. Mia lifted her camera to show a still image. She had captured the cub's paw, clawing weakly at the snow as the python tightened. It was painful to see, but important. Wildlife photography wasn't just about beauty. Sometimes it was about truth. This image, she said, isn't just a record of danger. It's a reminder that wild animals are caught in conflicts they never chose. She promised to send the photo to an animal sanctuary that documented threats to endangered animals, hoping it might spark awareness. The conversation stretched late into the night. Some villagers worried aloud. If one python were here, could there be more? Others dismissed it as an isolated case. But under their words lay a shared unease. The wild was no longer predictable. Climate change was already driving polar bears to wander further for food, sometimes appearing near towns in search of scraps. Now the idea of rare animals, tropical predators emerging where they didn't belong, added another layer of uncertainty. It was no longer enough to respect nature's rhythms. One had to also reckon with the disruptions humans had set in motion. Daniel, though weary, spoke with clarity. When I was a boy, my father taught me that wild animals live by laws we shouldn't break. But tonight, I see it differently. Sometimes those laws have already been rewritten by us. And when that happens, maybe stepping in isn't interference. Maybe it's responsibility. His words hung heavy in the room, a fisherman's wisdom reshaped by a single act of wildlife rescue. This fresh perspective matters. Too often, people think of human-wildlife encounters in simple terms, leave them alone or save them. But the truth is more layered. Not every rescue is about playing hero. Sometimes it's about restoring balance after humans tilt the scales. The python wasn't at fault, yet the cub's survival still mattered more in this fragile ecosystem. And though villagers argued, one point drew nods from all. No one who saw those eyes pleading, gasping, could have walked away unchanged. As the meeting drew to a close, Gregory offered a final reflection. Predators teach us about strength and survival, but they also teach us humility. We don't control nature, but our choices echo inside it. Each time a pet is released, each time a species crosses a border, we write new stories into the wild stories like the one you live today. His voice softened. The question now is not whether the cub will survive, but whether we will learn from this predator before another clash comes. The room fell quiet, the truth too sharp to deny. Daniel and Mia stepped into the night air, the cold bracing but clear. The stars stretched endlessly above the dark coast. Behind them, the village murmured, still wrestling with what the python represented. Ahead of them, the cub waited fragile but alive. And somewhere out there, the predator moved unseen, carrying its hunger into a land that did not belong to it. Understanding python hadn't made the threat smaller. It had made it real, and real threats demand choices. The choice was now sharper than ever. To free the cub was one thing. To ensure it lived another day was another entirely. The rescue had begun, but could Daniel and Mia carry it through? In the next part, we follow them back into the snow as hesitation turned into a fight for survival that neither of them would forget. Snow pressed under Daniel's boots as he followed Mia back to the cub. The village meeting had given them clarity, but not comfort. The python was gone, yet the cub's breaths were shallow ribs, quivering with each effort. Survival wasn't guaranteed just because the coils had been pried loose. This was the true rescue, the part that tested patience, courage, and conviction. Daniel crouched beside the cub, unsure whether to touch it. He knew polar bear mothers were never far away, and human scent could change everything. But the cub's condition demanded action. It tried to lift its head, then collapsed again, a muffled cry escaping. "We can't just leave it," Mia said, her voice steadier than her eyes. She had photographed countless wild animals, but watching one this fragile, this small, stirred something deeper. She set her camera down, trading distance for closeness. The decision carried weight. Wildlife rescue is never simple. Sanctuaries across Alaska warn that human involvement can make wild animals dependent, stripping them of instincts they need to survive. But here, with an endangered animal with a predator introduced by human hands, the lines blurred. To act meant stepping into that gray space. Daniel remembered a story from years back. A black bear cub had been found tangled in fishing nets near Kodiak. Rescuers debated for hours before cutting it free, fearing the mother would abandon it. In the end, they took the risk, and the cub rejoined its family days later. That memory pressed against his doubt. Sometimes hesitation killed more quickly than action. He reached for the cub, gently pressing his ear close to its chest. The heartbeat was faint but present. The ribs were tender, bruised by the constriction. "It's alive," he whispered. Mia nodded, pulling a scarf from her coat to wrap lightly around the cub for warmth. Their breath formed clouds in the air as they worked in silence, broken only by the cub's small wheezes. There was mystery in this moment, too. Why had the cub been alone? Polar bear mothers rarely leave their young. Was she hunting, or had she been driven off by the python's presence? Questions hovered, but answers would not come tonight. All that mattered was keeping the cub breathing until morning. Mia suggested moving it closer to the village. Daniel hesitated. Bringing a wild animal into human spaces was risky, even dangerous. But the cub's trembling body chose him. Together, they carried it slowly, careful not to jolt its fragile lungs. Each step felt like a gamble, a balance between urgency and caution. As they walked, Mia spoke softly, more to herself than to Daniel. "I've spent years capturing images of wild animals, thinking that was enough. But a camera can't hold a heartbeat." Her words hung in the cold air, carrying a quiet lesson. Witnessing is powerful, but sometimes life asks for more than watching. Sometimes it asks for hands, not lenses. At the village edge, a small group waited: Samuel the elder, Dr. Gregory, and a few others. They made space, eyes wide at the sight of the cub bundled in cloth. Gregory knelt to examine it, hands moving with practiced care. "Bruised ribs, shallow breathing, but no broken bones," he murmured. "It has a chance if we keep it warm." They placed the cub inside a makeshift pen lined with blankets, careful to avoid direct human touch. It whimpered faintly, a sound that pulled at every heart present. Samuel, whispered a prayer, something old and simple, thanking the sea for sparing a life. Here the story widened. Villagers who once argued now acted together. One woman fetched warm water bottles, another brought dried fish oil for energy. A child placed a small carved bear beside the cub, as if comfort could travel through wood. These gestures weren't just about survival, they were about connection. The cub had become more than an animal in distress. It had become a mirror reflecting the compassion still alive in human hands. But not everyone agreed. A fisherman muttered that interfering would only bring trouble. What if the mother smells us? What if she rejects it? He asked. His concern was real. Polar bear mothers are fiercely protective, and human scent can sometimes lead them to abandon their young. Yet Gregory countered, the python already changed the rules. Doing nothing now would be the greater disruption. His words reframed the debate. Sometimes rescue is not interference, it is correction. As the cub's breathing steadied, Daniel felt relief mingled with unease. He knew this was only a pause. Tomorrow might bring a mother searching, or predators lurking, or simply exhaustion overtaking the cub. This was not a finished story. It was a fragile chapter. In that uncertainty lay the mystery that kept everyone awake. What if the cub survived? What if it didn't? What if their choice shifted the path of the Arctic in some unseen way? Each possibility carried weight. And yet as Mia leaned close, watching the cub's tiny chest rise and fall, she whispered, "Right now, it's enough that it's alive." For the audience, there's a truth here worth holding on to. Rescues are rarely clean. They are messy, uncertain, and full of risk. But within that risk lies the chance to affirm something larger than ourselves, the belief that every heartbeat, even of a rare animal, even of a cub many will never see in person, is worth protecting. The villagers settled into a vigil, trading shifts to watch over the cub through the night. Snow fell quietly outside, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, a single life flickered against the cold, held aloft by the will of strangers who chose to care. The fresh perspective came not from the cub alone, but from what it stirred in those who gathered. They realized wildlife rescue is not only about saving wild animals, it's about remembering humanity's role in a world we have reshaped. Every rescue, every intervention, every hand extended is a reminder that compassion does not stop at the edge of our species. As dawn approached, the cub stirred, lifting its head for the first time since the struggle. Its eyes met Daniel's, faint but steady. It was a moment that no wildlife photography could capture fully, a moment that belonged not to cameras, but to hearts. But saving a cub is only the first act. Survival requires more than breath. It requires acceptance back into the rhythms of the wild. And as the sun rose over the ice, a new question formed: what would the community do when the mother returned, or if she never did? By morning, word had traveled farther than the snow. Every home in the village knew about the polar bear cub that had been pulled from the coils of a python. And by the time Daniel and Mia stepped into the community hall again, they felt the weight of eyes, curious, worried, divided. The cub lay in a sheltered pen behind the hall, guarded by 2 volunteers. Its breathing had steadied, but bruises still marked its sides. Every so often it whimpered a sound that made children press closer while elders turned away uncertain. The rescue had begun, but the real conflict was just starting. Samuel, the elder fisherman, spoke first. "We've lived alongside wild animals longer than we can remember. We don't step into their struggles." But this wasn't their struggle, it was ours. That snake did not belong here. His voice was steady, carrying conviction, but not everyone agreed. A younger man named Hunter shook his head. "Nature decides, always has. If we interfere every time we see suffering, where does it end? A cub today, a wolf tomorrow. We'll forget that wild animals must fight to live." His words echoed the doubt that lingered in many hearts. The debate sharpened. Some pointed out that polar bears were already endangered, their numbers slipping as ice melted each year. To lose a cub meant more than just one life, it meant losing a thread in a fragile fabric. Others warned that feeding or caring for it too long would mark it, leaving it unable to return to the wild. Mia lifted her camera, but didn't raise it. She remembered last night when she chose to act instead of record. Now, she chose words instead of images. "I've photographed bears for years," she said softly. "But I've never seen one look at me the way this cub did. Not as prey, not as a threat, just as if it wanted to breathe. That isn't interference. That's empathy." Her voice cracked slightly and the room quieted. Gregory, the biologist, stepped forward with a measured tone. "Every wildlife rescue sits at a crossroads. Sanctuaries exist for this reason, to heal without taming, to prepare for return. If we do nothing, we risk letting an invasive predator define this cub's fate. If we do too much, we risk domesticating it. The challenge is not whether to act, but how." He shared an example from Florida. Years ago, a rare panther cub was found near death after its mother was struck by a car. Locals debated for days. In the end, an animal rescue center took it in, treated its injuries, and carefully reintroduced it to the wild. That cub later raised young of its own. Sometimes, Gregory explained, intervention doesn't break nature, it repairs it. The question wasn't simply yes or no, save or abandon. The question was responsibility. If humans caused the imbalance, whether through invasive species or shrinking ice, then humans also carried the burden to respond. But responsibility carried fear. What if the mother returned and smelled human scent? What if the cub weakened and marked was rejected? Samuel leaned on his cane, eyes narrowing. "I've seen mothers walk away for less," he admitted. The risk was real. Still, Daniel couldn't shake the memory of the cub gasping in his arms. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Doing nothing is a choice too, and that choice would have buried it last night." His words didn't settle the argument, but they shifted the air. Silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the cub whimpering behind the wall. Outside, villagers argued in smaller groups. Some whispered about the danger of keeping a predator so close to homes. Others stood by the pen, watching the cub breathe, convinced that saving it gave the village itself a reason to believe. A few children sketched drawings of the cub, labeling it the little survivor. For them, the story was not about debate, it was about hope. Rescue wasn't only about animals, it was about people. The cub had forced the village to confront itself, to ask what it valued more: tradition or compassion, non-interference or responsibility. The debate was less about one life and more about what kind of community they wanted to be. In the midst of the voices, Mia pulled Daniel aside. She held up her camera. "I could publish this," she said. "Wildlife photography magazines would spread it everywhere. People would see a rare animal struggle and know what we did." Daniel frowned. "And then what? People come here chasing cute animals for their pictures. Tourists wanting to watch cubs instead of protecting them." His caution carried weight. Sharing too widely could attract attention the cub didn't need. But Mia answered gently. "Or maybe it reminds people that endangered animals aren't just numbers in reports. They're living, breathing, fragile." She lowered the camera again. "Maybe some stories aren't meant to be published yet. Maybe they're meant to be lived." As evening fell, the debate softened but didn't vanish. People returned to their homes with mixed feelings. Some carried pride that the cub lived another day. Others carried unease that nature's laws had been crossed. Yet everyone, even those who disagreed, felt the echo of the cub's cry inside them. It was a sound that changed silence into responsibility. Stories like this don't end with a single decision. They ripple. They shape communities, challenge beliefs, and leave marks that last long after the snow melts. The cub was breathing, yes, but the village itself had been stirred awake, reminded that in a changing world, old rules sometimes demand new choices. Before leaving the hall, Gregory looked back at Daniel and Mia. "You both carried a burden last night," he said. "Now the village carries it with you. Remember this: saving a life is never the end of the story. It's the start of responsibility." His words carried mystery, hinting at challenges yet unseen. Daniel glanced toward the pen one last time. The cub slept, its sides rising more steadily now. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. But behind it lay questions too large for one night. Would the mother return? Would the cub grow strong enough to rejoin her? Or would the village itself become its sanctuary? Those answers would not come in debates or photographs. They would come in the long days of healing ahead as the cub's strength returned or faltered. The next step was no longer about saving a heartbeat. It was about giving that heartbeat a chance to grow, and that journey began with care. The cub's first night in the pen had been restless. It whimpered often, rolling to one side, ribs aching from the python's grip. By dawn, Daniel and Mia found themselves keeping vigil like worried parents. Each faint breath felt like a fragile gift. The rescue was no longer a single act. It had become a long commitment. Gregory explained the basics of recovery. Polar bear cubs are tough, but without their mother, they're vulnerable. They need warmth, fat for energy, and time to heal. Too much handling could ruin its chance of returning to the wild. His words struck a balance between caution and hope. The village now faced not only the act of saving, but the discipline of waiting. Mia poured a small dish of fish oil near the cub, careful not to touch. At first, it ignored the food, weak and disoriented. Hours later, it licked slowly, then licked again. The sound was so faint, but to those watching it was thunder. The cub was choosing life. Daniel felt an ache in his chest as he watched. Years at sea had hardened him to loss. He had seen nets pulled, empty storms swallow boats, and animals vanish into the deep. Yet here a cub's small tongue against oil made him feel something he thought age had stolen: wonder. He turned to Mia. "It's fighting back," he said. She nodded, raising her camera but lowering it again before pressing the shutter. Some moments belonged only to memory. The days stretched into a rhythm. Volunteers took turns watching the cub. Children whispered stories to it through the wooden slats of the pen. One girl called it Snowdrop because of the tiny flecks of white fur clinging even where bruises spread. Daniel preferred not to name it, fearing attachment. Still, when no one was listening, he caught himself murmuring the name too. Healing was not only physical. It stirred something in the people. The same fisherman who had argued against interference now brought buckets of snow to keep the pen cool. He never admitted he'd changed his mind, but his actions spoke. The cub had shifted the village's heart, and yet mystery lingered. Would the mother return? Some tracks had been seen near the shoreline, but no bear appeared. Each night, villagers wondered if the cub would be reclaimed or if they would need to prepare for an animal sanctuary far from Alaska. The uncertainty held them in suspense. Gregory offered an example from Norway. A polar bear cub orphaned when its mother drowned during a long swim had been taken to a sanctuary. It grew strong and later rejoined wild bears on the ice. "It can happen," he said, "but only if we walk the line carefully, help enough for survival. Never so much that it forgets it's wild." His example gave the villagers a blueprint to nurture without taming. This balance carried a lesson: compassion must be wise. To love an animal too closely risks reshaping it. To step back too quickly risks losing it. True wildlife rescue lives in that tension where care is measured, not indulgent. The villagers learned to restrain their affection, even when the cub looked at them with eyes that could melt steel. One evening, as Daniel leaned on the pen, watching the cub breathe more evenly, Samuel approached. "You've carried this burden heavily," the elder said. Daniel shrugged. "I just did what anyone would have done?" Samuel shook his head. "Not anyone. Many would have walked away. You reminded us that even rare animals deserve a chance, no matter how complicated it makes our lives." The words humbled Daniel, who had spent years thinking his role ended when he left the sea. Now he felt part of something larger than himself. The fresh perspective revealed itself in small actions. Wildlife photography had always been Mia's way of honoring wild animals, but this experience shifted her lens. "Images can stir hearts," she admitted one night, "but actions test them. Maybe my work isn't just to capture beauty. It's to remind people that beauty is fragile." She began planning a series of photographs, not to sell but to donate to sanctuary, raising awareness of endangered animals. For her, the cub was no longer just a subject. It was a teacher. The cub's progress became the pulse of the village. Each day, when it ate a little more or walked a few shaky steps, relief spread like warmth through the community. Children giggled at its clumsy paws, calling it a cute animal, even as elders warned them to keep their distance. Hope became their shared language. And still, the mother's absence weighed on everyone. Some believed she was gone for good. Others held faith that she would return. Each track in the snow was studied, each shadow on the horizon scanned. The uncertainty added a layer of suspense, a reminder that healing is never guaranteed. But perhaps that was the deeper truth. Hope itself is fragile, like breath in winter. The cub's survival could not be promised, but it could be nurtured. And nurturing became the work of every hand in the village, binding them together in ways no one had expected. By the second week, the cub's bruises faded, and its steps grew steadier. It began to push against the pen, testing its strength. Gregory smiled as he watched. That's a good sign. Wild animals should resist cages, even temporary ones. His words lifted spirits. The cub was remembering it was meant for the ice, not for walls. Healing is not about keeping, it's about letting go. The villagers began to prepare themselves for the day when the cub would either return to its mother or leave for the wild. Their role was temporary, a bridge between suffering and survival. And sometimes being the bridge is enough. On the 14th night, Daniel stood outside under the aurora, the sky painted in ribbons of green. He thought about his grandson, the first time he had held him in a hospital years ago, small and fragile, unsure if life would hold. Watching the cub now gave him the same feeling, fear wrapped in tenderness. He whispered aloud, "Courage isn't being fearless. It's caring even when fear tells you to step back." Inside, the cub slept soundly, its chest rising steadily and sure. The village slept lighter too, each person holding a piece of its hope. Yet healing a cub is only part of the story. The Arctic is not kind to weakness, and nature's balance never pauses. What happens when one predator loses its meal, when survival shifts from one animal to another? The rescue raised hope, yes, but also questions that reached beyond this village, questions about consequences that ripple through the wild. And those ripples were about to show themselves. By the third week, the cub's strength had returned enough to stir questions the village could no longer avoid. Saving a life had felt noble. But in quiet conversations by the shore, people began to wonder what happens when survival is interrupted. In nature, nothing is free. If one predator loses its meal, another must carry that loss. Gregory, the biologist, gathered the villagers one evening. He sketched in the snow with a stick, drawing circles for prey and arrows for predators. Every bite taken or missed shifts the balance. When a python goes hungry, it looks for another animal. When a cub is spared, it competes for food later. The wild is a constant exchange. His voice carried no judgment, only fact. Daniel thought about that python disappearing into the brush. Did it find a rabbit, a bird, or did it starve? He would never know. He would never. But he knew this much: the cub's survival had cost something else somewhere. That truth settled heavily on him. Mia wrestled with it differently. She recalled a case she had once photographed in Montana, a wolf pack deprived of prey by human interference. The wolves grew desperate, moving closer to farms, which triggered conflict with ranchers. One rescue can save, but it can also push tension elsewhere. Wildlife rescue is never isolated. It echoes. The villagers argued again. Some said the python's hunger didn't matter. It didn't belong in Alaska. Others countered that suffering is still suffering, whether native or not. Samuel, leaning on his cane, summarized the dilemma. Compassion always carries a price. The question is not whether we pay it, but whether we pay it knowingly. Saving one life is never the end of the story. It ripples outward, shifting balance in ways both visible and unseen. The villagers were learning that compassion isn't clean. It's tangled like nets that catch fish, but also entangle dolphins. And yet, refusing compassion doesn't untangle the net either. It only leaves the struggle unseen. Gregory brought in examples from across the world. He spoke of the Everglades, where invasive pythons consumed deer fawns, forcing Florida panthers, already endangered animals, to travel farther for food. He told of a wildlife rescue in Canada, where people freed a moose calf from icy waters, only to learn later that wolves in the area went hungry that winter. Each act of rescue is both mercy and disruption. Neither erases the other. Mia looked at her camera, heavy in her hands. She realized photography had always let her capture moments without consequences. But this time her lens couldn't insulate her from the cost of action. She said quietly to Daniel, "Maybe the question isn't whether consequences exist. Maybe it's whether we're willing to carry them." Daniel nodded slowly. For him, the cub's heartbeat against his ear that first night outweighed the mystery of unseen ripples. The fresh perspective emerged from the cub itself. As it stumbled more steadily on its paws, testing strength, it reminded everyone that consequences are not only burdens, they can also be possibilities. A cub alive means a chance for one more hunter on the ice, one more symbol of endurance. Nature's balance isn't about perfection, it's about resilience. And sometimes resilience begins with mercy. To make this real, Gregory introduced the children to another story, the wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone. When wolves were gone, elk herds grew too large, stripping trees and damaging rivers. When wolves returned, balance was restored. Sometimes, he said, intervention restores what's missing. Sometimes it distorts. The challenge is knowing which is which. The children listened wide-eyed, seeing in the cub not just a victim, but a future predator that might one day shape the ice itself. The debate never ended, but it evolved. Instead of arguing whether the cub should have been saved, the villagers asked how to live with the consequences. Could they prepare sanctuaries for rare animals displaced by change? Could they protect the balance without pretending every choice was perfect? These questions softened the division of responsibility. One evening, Mia stood at the shoreline, camera slung across her back. She spotted the cub waddling inside its pen, stronger now, even playful at moments. She whispered, "Cute animals shouldn't make us forget they're also hunters." Her words carried both tenderness and caution. Hope was rising, but so was awareness. Daniel sat nearby, sharpening a knife he no longer needed at sea. "When I was younger," he said, "I thought survival was about taking. But watching that cub taught me survival can also be about giving." It was a perspective only age and loss could shape. His words echoed what many felt, that balance isn't a fixed line. It's a shifting weight we sometimes help carry. The cub's recovery forced the village to accept uncertainty as part of the rescue. They didn't know if the python starved, if another predator went without, or if saving one cub changed a chain they could never see. But they knew this. Their choice carried consequences they were willing to live with. And perhaps that's the mystery worth holding. Compassion doesn't erase nature's harshness. It coexists with it. The wild is full of endings. Humans can't prevent them all. But sometimes stepping in to rewrite one ending gives the world a chance at a new beginning. As the cub grew stronger, its presence became more than a question of balance. It became a question of belonging. Would it rejoin its mother, return to the ice, or become forever tied to the village that saved it? To answer that, the story had to step beyond survival into the wider canvas of the Arctic, a place where climate predators and people all collide. By the fourth week, the cub could stand firmly, padding clumsily around the pen. Children laughed at its wobbly steps, calling it a cute animal, while elders watched quietly, reminded that every wobble carried the weight of survival. The rescue had grown into something larger than a single cub. It had become a mirror, reflecting the fragility of the Arctic itself. Gregory gathered the community once more, this time outside by the ice. He pointed toward the horizon where the sea stretched endlessly and was cold. "This cub is not just one life. It is a sign of what is at stake. The Arctic is shifting beneath our feet, and every polar bear cub is now part of a bigger story." His words pressed into the silence. He explained in plain terms. Polar bears depend on sea ice to hunt seals. Without ice, they swim longer distances, burn fat reserves, and risk starvation. Cubs especially are vulnerable. Each lost platform of ice is a lost chance at survival. We call them endangered animals, Gregory said, but that label hides the truth. They are signals of a world unraveling. Daniel listened with a furrowed brow. He had fished these waters since he was a boy, had watched winters shorten and storms grow harsher. He thought of the python, a rare animal here yet somehow present, and realized it wasn't just a freak event. It was another crack in the pattern. Mia stepped forward, holding her camera. She showed the villagers 2 images side by side. One was of the cub, eyes closed, bruised, fighting for air. The other was of the same cub days later, standing on shaky paws. "This is more than wildlife photography," she said. "It's evidence. It shows that survival is possible, but only with help. And if the Arctic keeps shrinking, help will be needed more often than we can give." Her words sparked conversation. Some wondered aloud if sanctuaries would become the future animal rescue centers, where wild animals like polar bears would be cared for as their habitats vanished. Others resisted the idea, fearing it would turn wildness into captivity. Samuel voiced what many felt. A sanctuary is a shelter, but it is not a home. If the ice is gone, where will the cubs return to? His question lingered without an answer. To make the stakes real, Gregory shared another story. He told of a polar bear cub found drifting on broken ice near Barrow. Rescuers pulled it to shore, fed it in an animal sanctuary, and released it weeks later. But when tracked, it struggled to find seals, forced to swim between shrinking patches of ice. "We saved it," Gregory admitted, "but the ice did not." The villagers understood rescue can save individuals, but not ecosystems. Compassion is powerful, but it cannot substitute for preservation. Healing on cub matters deeply, but without protecting the Arctic, countless others will face the same fate. The villagers realized their role wasn't just to guard one rare animal, but to guard the conditions that made survival possible. This brought a fresh perspective. The rescue was not a distraction from larger issues. It was a doorway into them. By saving one cub, the villagers had confronted the truth that the Arctic itself needed saving. Their choice, born of instinct and empathy, had opened their eyes to the broader fight against climate change, invasive species, and human encroachment. Mia suggested sharing the story widely, not for fame, but to inspire action. When people see a cub in distress, they see innocence. They see themselves. They remember that even wild animals carry hope. She imagined her photos reaching classrooms, sanctuaries, and conservation groups. Not as spectacle, but as testimony. Daniel ever practical? Wondered aloud. If we tell this story, will people just see a cute animal, or will they see the fragile ice behind it? Gregory answered with conviction, "We must trust that some will see both. And those who see both will act." That night, under the glow of the aurora, the villagers discussed what they could do. Some proposed reducing waste. Others talked about joining regional conservation groups. A few even offered to guide visitors, respectfully teaching them the realities of life in the Arctic instead of selling it as scenery. The cub's survival had sparked something more enduring. Responsibility stretched beyond the village. The mystery remained unsolved, whether the mother would return, whether the cub would rejoin the wild, or move to an animal sanctuary. But perhaps the greater mystery was how a single moment of animal rescue had awakened so much awareness. The villagers began to understand that the Arctic was not just a backdrop. It was a fragile stage where every actor, human bear, or even python, played a role in the unfolding story. Rare animals like polar bears are not just symbols for scientists or activists. They are teachers. They remind people that survival is both delicate and interconnected. To lose them is not only to lose beauty, but to lose balance itself. On the 7th night, the cub climbed awkwardly atop a snow mound, standing taller than it had before. Children cheered softly. Adults smiled, though some wiped their eyes. It was not just the cub standing, it was hope itself rising, if only for a moment. Yet hope alone would not decide the cub's fate. The Arctic could teach, could inspire, but it could also demand. And soon the villagers would face the final choice to hold on or to let go. The question was no longer just whether the cub could survive, it was whether they were ready to release it back to the wild, and what that release would mean for them all. The day finally came when the cub was strong enough to walk without stumbling. Its ribs no longer heaved painfully, and its eyes, once dull, now held the sharpness of the wild. The village gathered at the edge of the ice to watch. Some carried quiet pride, others carried fear, but all carried the weight of knowing this moment mattered. Daniel knelt near the cub one last time. He didn't touch it. He knew better, but he whispered, "You've got your chance. Take it." Behind him, Mia raised her camera, but for a long time didn't press the shutter. She wanted to capture the moment, but she also wanted to honor it. Some things belong to memory more than pictures. Gregory explained softly to the group, "Wildlife rescue is never about keeping. It's about giving back. An animal's sanctuary can heal a wound, but only the wild can give meaning to a predator's life." His words framed the release as more than a farewell. It was a return to balance, imperfect but necessary. The cub stepped forward onto the snow, pausing as if uncertain. The air was cold, the horizon endless. For a moment, everyone held their breath. Then it walked on pause, pressing into the ice as though claiming its place again. A cheer rose from the children, but the adults stayed silent, recognizing the solemnity of letting go. Saving one polar bear cub did not fix the Arctic, did not solve climate change, and did not undo the damage of invasive species. But it mattered. It mattered because life is not measured only in numbers. It is measured in chances given in compassion, chosen in stories told. Samuel the elder leaned on his cane and said, "This cub will forget us. That is as it should be. But we will remember it. That is as it must be." His words gave voice to what everyone felt, that rescue changes the rescuer as much as the rescued. The python's coils, the cub gasping, the moment of hesitation. It was a reminder that compassion often begins not with certainty, but with fear. The lesson was simple yet profound. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act anyway. Knowledge had also deepened. They now understood more about predator-prey balance, about the risks of invasive species, and about the fragile role of endangered animals in an ecosystem that is unraveling. But knowledge alone does not stir hearts. What stirred them was emotion, the way a small cub, fragile and bruised, had united a village in purpose. For Mia, the experience reshaped her work. She knew her wildlife photography could no longer be just about beauty. It had to be about testimony. Each photo would carry not just light and shadow, but urgency. For Daniel, it was a quiet rebirth. A retired fisherman who thought his days of purpose had ended had discovered that purpose does not retire. It finds new forms, sometimes in nets, sometimes in hands that pry apart coils. Saving one life is not a distraction from bigger problems. It is a reminder of why bigger problems matter. Climate change statistics can feel distant. Habitat loss can feel abstract. But a single cub gasping for breath turns abstraction into reality. That is the power of one life. It makes the invisible visible. As the cub disappeared into the distance, its white fur blending with the ice, the villagers stood quietly. They knew it might not survive the harshness ahead. They knew the Arctic was still fragile. But they also knew they had given it a chance, and that chance carried hope. And hope, like ice, may crack, but can also hold. So what does it mean to save one life? It means recognizing that mercy is not weakness, it is strength. It means accepting that our choices carry consequences, but choosing compassion anyway. It means remembering that even among wild animals, rare animals and endangered animals, the story of survival is not just theirs. It is ours too. And now, dear viewer, the story turns to you. Think of the moments in your life when you hesitated, when you stood between fear and action. Would you have stepped in for the polar bear cub? Would you have chosen to risk consequences for compassion? These questions are not just about the Arctic. They are about the lives we touch every day, human or otherwise. If this story has reminded you of the value of a single heartbeat, carry that reflection forward. Let it shape the way you see wild animals, the way you support conservation, the way you choose empathy in small and large moments. And if you want to continue walking with us through stories that hold both knowledge and emotion, stories of wildlife rescue, animal sanctuary efforts, and the fragile beauty of rare animals, then I invite you to join our community. Like this video if it touched you. Subscribe if you believe in the power of stories that connect us to wild animals and to each other. Your presence here means you are part of this journey, a journey where every life, no matter how small, matters.